Oh, God. Okay.
So I've got like the one thing, and I know you have your list.
Anything show.
I told you I woke up. I don't woke up.
We talk about anything sometimes happens.
Anything
And
sometimes happens.
E.
How uncommittal can you be? It's even though he's I guess it's sometimes.
Anything happens.
I just woke up.
So, I don't necessarily have, I guess, topic.
Okay, well, we can just go into the question I want to ask you. Because that's really a question for you.
Oh.
Rather than like, hey, cheese? What do you think? Like, it's not like that.
Okay.
So I want to preface this by saying you don't have to like say anything you don't want to. And when I ask you this, it's not like, what are you, fucking stupid? Okay?
You're okay. I trust
Like second dip. So you're not shy about it on Facebook. You're very open about it. It's your banner. Do you really think decolonizing is a thing that should happen?
Yes. And I'll tell you why. There is a difference between learning and coming to where we are now, like as far as technology goes, and decolonizing as a topic of self-learning. And the reason I say this is because it comes actually in a perfect time. This question comes to me actually, yeah, in a perfect time. And that's because I'm actually reading currently Paulo Freire, who's a Brazilian philosopher and what do you call it, educator, I guess, scholar, and he wrote about. He passed away, I think, in like the mid to late 80s, and this year actually is the 50th anniversary of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is what I'm reading right now, and so it's what I'm getting into. And the whole thing that he writes about is stuff that I like daily talk about and like share philosophically with like you and other friends and family. And it's this concept of and I think, well, I mean, yeah, on my personal page I don't shy away from it, but I am by far greatly appreciative of very powerful and like respectable and self-aware white people like you and like other professors that I know and teachers and mentors that I've had and friends who know that there's a certain kind of like privilege that you have that I don't have, and we've been through plenty of situations where this is like you've made it known, like, okay, like I'm the guy who needs to cool this down or like take charge.
You're not wrong.
So like you've like put your foot down. You're like, look, let me take care of this, and like it plays out like better than if I were to be the face of it, or if somebody else were to be, the person to like run it through. And so the decolonizing comes from concepts of, when he talks about the or pedagogy of the oppressed, there's like a duality to it. The oppressed need to, and he says decolonize, but when the decolonizing happens, it's going back and learning who you are, going back learning your roots, going back learning what you are. And in the introduction to it, to his writing. His one of his mentees, Mercado, I think Daniel Mercado is his name, um, writes about how a lot of people in the United States do not learn about these writings and these books because the excuse is that it's too heavy and it's too much and it's too much like deep thinking of like of the self. And it gets into the concept of, what, the truth hurts. And so, me, when in my own decolonization, I went, like, I was grown or raised in a Catholic home, and I, in my own like self learning and decolonizing, I was like, okay, what was before that though? Like, our people were not raised and born, Catholics. We learned and we went by something else. So, what was that something else? And what was the process of us becoming Catholics? And you look at the history of it, it's vicious, it's ravenous, it's monstrous, and it's inhumane the way that we learned to be Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
And that we were brainwashed to become Catholic. And that we were like raped into becoming Catholics. And so the decolonizing of it, it's learning how to accept, what, this truth that I have been told for so long isn't my ancestors' truth. Does that mean that all of a sudden there's no God for me? Does that mean that all of a sudden there's no spirituality for me? No, it's not that. It's just that I need to learn what that was and what that is. And so, on as far as the oppressed, that's what Freire talks about, being decolonized and decolonizing. Learning about who you are, learning how to break these, I don't want to say false truth, because to some people this is just like how they are. And I've married a Catholic woman who is very respectable to what I've chosen, but also knows that for her it's not necessarily the path that she wants to go. We got married in the Catholic Church. We're also going to get married via our tribal and indigenous and ancestral practice. She's doing it out of respect for me. I'm doing it out of respect for her. Whether she ends up changing her mind down the line and seeing like, what, this is what I feel more connected to, that's up to her. That's her own like right to choose. But, it's really hard. Freire and I like talk about how it's really hard to learn who you truly are if you're not able to accept and or learn about who your people were. Oh, okay. All right. So yeah, that's what he discusses when it's talking about decolonizing of the oppressed. Now, there's also a decolonizing of the oppressor, and that is when we get into that is where we get into like a lot of the muck of what some people who don't understand like systematic oppression and systematic racism, that's where a lot of like the privilege sits. Now, what Freire does talk about is that the oppression doesn't necessarily just sit there with race or ethnicity. It's also classism. It's also sexism and everything. But he does acknowledge that throughout history and throughout especially Latin American countries, African countries, there's a certain type of person that fits that mold. Now, in the decolonizing of the oppressed, he talks about how an oppressor, just like for the vague, answer, or I guess label or whatever, it is possible for the oppressor to learn and to acknowledge that they have a factor in oppressing, and that being able to understand that and acknowledge that may create more like self-destruction to the oppressor, but it does not mean that the oppressor automatically becomes in solidarity with other oppressors, and that it is very possible and very needed for people who are oppressors to acknowledge that there's a, I guess, factor that they have in oppressing and that they can benefit from oppressing, but to become in solidarity with the oppressed. So, decolonizing doesn't, what some people don't understand is that it doesn't mean like we need to go back to like the Stone Age, or we need to go back to like fucking riding horses, or we need to send people back to where they belong regionally or whatever, where their ancestors came from. But what it does mean is acknowledging who benefits from what, why, and learning about how those things can change, and how we can relearn aspects and philosophies of respect. So that I hope gives a little bit more clarity as to what I mean by decolonizing, and maybe I need to even answer answer to what you thought I meant by decolonizing.
Well, just so before we go any further with that, I want to make sure I understand what you're saying by. So, the way I understand what you're saying, for you, decolonizing is not the literal act of removing people,
Correct.
Mainly white people, from this country and sending them away.
Correct.
It's something prudent upon the individual to learn themselves, to understand if they are the oppressor or the oppressee, where they were before that status quo came into place.
Correct.
And what that means for them in their communities and such.
Yeah.
It's
loose. Yes, yeah, but
just so I'm sort of in the ballpark of what you're getting at.
Yeah.
Okay. So the reason why I wanted to talk to you about this is because that word, decolonizing, I had no idea had this other definition. There's this Freda was the name of it?
Yeah, Freda. Yeah, exactly.
So the definition that this person posits, and just that new way of looking at that word that you've been talking about, I was completely unaware about.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like 95% of the world is completely unaware of that definition.
Yeah.
So, just without knowing any of that, and then seeing the rhetoric you use when you bring up that word online, because we haven't really talked about specifically this in person, just seeing that online, and like seeing it plastered on your Facebook banner, and just seeing that word, it's like, okay, does he really think this like specifically this country just needs to kick all the white people out, and then that'll solve everything? Yeah, because to me there's a lot that I don't agree with that, obviously.
No.
So I mean, now that I know what that word means and where you're coming from, at least in layman's understanding, like kindergarten level of what you're talking about. I mean, it makes sense to me. I get it 100%. Like, that's all. It makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that aspect of it is very, I think, poignant and true. Of we refuse to, like, whether it's in our education system or in our personal lives, to not necessarily accept what's happened, but we're more willing to be like, that was that, like, like, why do I need to carry that burden? Like, oh, that was 300 years ago, 50 years ago. Like, we don't need to, like, you have to know.
Yeah.
Like, you have to be aware. You have to put yourself in that situation to understand. Or else we're going to live our lives like we do up until, like, what was it, like 5th grade, when we were taught, yeah, hey, Columbus wasn't a good guy.
Yeah.
He like murdered tens of thousands of people.
Yep.
Like by the week, like he was a piece of shit. Instead of like what we were taught up until then, it's like, yeah, this like high five, did like Red Rover, and then like, hey, we made America, guys. Like, no, that shit's bullshit.
Yeah.
And like even in 5th grade, I was like offended that I had been lied to this whole time. Like I was like,
Yeah.
why teach me? Why make it so important that I learn all these things, and then you're just hiding a lie to me?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of kids would feel that way, and just like in every regard, just tell the fucking truth to kids, and they can fucking take it.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, that shows like systematically how we refuse to acknowledge the things. And I mean,
Mm-hmm.
not to get into all Texas education system, but it gets even worse, you know, as of recently. But not to be all PBS, but knowledge is power for everybody.
Yeah.
You have to know.
Yeah.
And you can't live your life without learning that, or else then you're the people who get memed as bigots on the internet, and you get exposed as being ignorant.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it just needs a new word, what you're talking about. Because decolonizing, like, it just is. And part of me, like, just culturally now, I think about it as it's in the context of like race and how
Mm-hmm.
people treat each other. Culturally now, even though it came out like a year ago, people still reference those, like from Black Panther, like colonizers
Mm-hmm.
and all that. And so there's that sort of as a slur towards white people used in that movie as colonizers.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that as a broad cultural brush has affected a lot of people as using that word. So this term decolonizing, I think, invokes that emotion to a lot of people.
Well, yeah, no, and I see how it can, but I think that also comes from, or that also begins that process of the decolonizing of the oppressed, or I'm sorry, of the oppressor.
Like
it's where
relearning this or learning a new definition to that word. Is
exactly, yeah. So like as the
actually
oppressor is saying,
yeah.
like, okay, you know, there's this other issue also. How can I? And again, you know, you said like it may scare and or hurt feelings, but
that's very true.
But
I'm hearing it. Okay.
Yeah. So,
okay,
but
that's
it's like, you know,
that's really interesting.
That also is like part of that like, you know, it may create more self-destruction to the oppressor, but it's important because that oppressor needs to learn, you know, how that was affecting others. And so now you are not necessarily in solidarity with other oppressors who are doing things oppressingly purposefully. You now can take a step back and say, you know what? Yeah, no, this isn't right. So you take solidarity with the oppressed.
Okay. That's interesting what just happened there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm into that.
Yeah, so.
You've changed my mind. White people are wrong.
What
in
in
the
the
What in the wide, wide world of sports is going on here?